actually a lawyer, and I think the earlier speaker was talking about the biggest challenge being setting up the company and so on. So here's a lawyer who's going to explain and talk a lot about the establishing startups in Sri Lanka, the legal aspects. This is Mr. Nalliah Kumaraguruparan Ashokbharan, who's the attorney at law, and he's the director of Arogya Life Systems. So he will be talking to us about how to set up a company. Now, a little bit about his background. He's an attorney at law and a legal counsel in active practice in Sri Lanka. He has a degree in law and a master's from Edinburgh. He's a member of the UE Chambers and has represented and advised numerous local and multinational clients in several matters in a range of different legal areas, including employment and labor law, technology law, company law, and intellectual property law. So please go ahead, Mr. Ashokbharan.
Thank you. It was amazing to hear all these startup creators enthusiastically speaking. But I also see this as a symbolic thing that the lawyer come at last, because that is what happens with most of the startups here. Because every time I face with these challenges is the first time a startup walked into me, they had contracts signed, but they have not established a company. They have just put a name and signed contracts. And the biggest challenge is explaining them, no, this is not a person. This is not a legally recognized person. This company is not incorporated, and you can't enter into a contract. And starting from there are a lot of challenges. So this is one of the biggest pitfalls the startups in Sri Lanka go into. They just start their product. They're so focused. They are the best brains in IT, but all these legality for them is an unwanted red tape. But and they realize its importance at the last. And when they come, sometimes it can be too late to undo certain things which they have already done. As of now, establishing companies in Sri Lanka has been made very easier. Now you can do an online application process completely online, and you can receive certified copies of the approvals and everything online. The system has certain issues, I should say technical issues, but apart from that, it's a very effective model. The other challenge is what kind of a company you want to establish. Mostly when you are a startup, you always prefer a private limited company. But when you are establishing a private limited company, you have to understand in Sri Lanka, it can't exceed 50 shareholders. So suddenly one day, one of the startup directors just called me and said, I want to issue shares to all my employees. And I'm like, how many employees you have? And this person says, I have 40 employees. I said, you already have 5 shareholders, and if you're going to issue 40 employees, and he also has plans to expand it to other employees, then you can't continue to be a private limited company. Now, that is going to be another issue there. So you have to think about this. And however, the startups mainly, which I work with, they come with this startup idea, which they say their motive is to have an exit plan. So which means at some point they want to sell off their startup to a bigger company or a corporate and exit. And most of the investors are abroad, and at least a larger chunk of them are from Silicon Valley. So they prefer to have the company, the original company or the mother company based in the United States. So when you're having a mother company in the United States, the purpose for a local or Sri Lankan company in that context is only to manage the execution part. So that is why, at least in my experience with a few of the startups I worked with, that is the model they are looking into. So in that context, that will address 2 issues. Why I say that is more favorable is, one is the direct investment into Sri Lanka. Now, if foreign direct investment into Sri Lanka has several hurdles. You cannot, foreigners cannot invest in all aspects. There are restrictions, although I don't think any of these restrictions directly apply to the technological industry or the startups we see. I think the most stretched exception is that mass communication. So when it comes to mass communication, foreigners can't invest more than 40% of the share capital of the company. Apart from that, others are like resource-based production companies, which foreigners can't invest over 40%. And there are certain areas which foreign direct investment cannot, is completely barred, like money lending, pawn brokering, so on and so forth. However, if a foreign company has to invest in Sri Lanka, there's a minimum investment requirement of 200,000 US dollars. And most of the startups I have worked with, they do not start with fulfilling the minimum requirement, or they don't even foresee fulfilling that minimum requirement in the next 3 to 5 years. In that situation, the arrangement which they enter into is to have a mother company elsewhere that also facilitates their exit plan. That is most probably a US company in Delaware State. I think that is the most flexible vehicle for most US companies. And they have a company here which is owned by, which is either some of their shareholders hold a company here, and this company is like an outsourced service providing company. So this is the easiest structure, cost-effective structure. Most of the startups, at least in my experience, are opting to. So this is one of the biggest investment hurdles, if I have to mention. If this can be eased out, if there is policy, I think Professor Samarajiva is here, if these policies can be eased out, to make investment far more flexible, at least in the IT sector, because as I understand, most of the startups I had the opportunity to work with are IT startups. They are with information technology experts. So if this thing can be eased out, it's much it would be a greater advantage for all these potential Silicon Valley investors. But however, in my experience, the biggest problems I had to face with startups, or the startups actually had to bring it to me, is pertaining to the employment law, because they speak a lot about the Silicon Valley culture, and and inevitably one culture they look up to is hire and fire. So that is a American Donald Trumpish hire and fire thing. They somehow feel, and when the investors get to know, no, in Sri Lanka you can't hire and fire employees, they are kind of shocked. Because once you hire an employee as a permanent employee, sacking that employee for non-disciplinary grounds is almost impossible. The Termination of Employment of Workmen Act clearly says you cannot terminate an employee for non-disciplinary grounds. The only exceptions is either with the consent of that employee or with the consent of the Commissioner of Labor. But obtaining the consent of a Commissioner of Labor isn't an easy task either. And even if the Commissioner of Labor agrees, there is a compensation formula with a maximum of 1.25 million compensation. So if you go on to sack an employee for on non-disciplinary grounds, or even in disciplinary grounds, the employee is protected by various legal mechanisms. So you have to have a just and fair termination. If your termination is not just and fair, the employee can go before the before the labor tribunal, and most of the time these tribunals have the tendency to take an employee-centric view, which I believe in an objective sense is a bit of fair, because of the power imbalance between the employee and employer. But this is one of the biggest challenges. The employment law aspect is one of the biggest challenges for startups. One way the startups can manage this is by using fixed term employment contracts, which for a very new startups is a good idea. But then startups also have this contradictory interests or conflict of interest, where they also have the risk, they also don't want to run into a risk of permanently hiring an employee and being unable to sack the employee. Also, on the other hand, they don't want to go for a lower contract and have the risk of losing the employee. So that part, that balance is something. And because most of these startups, as Jay said, because I work with Jay wants to bring in established talent. So these startups want to bring in talent who are actually in a permanent job elsewhere. So whoever is going to come is going to expect that job security. So this is one of the challenges which the startups need to address. And there had been, especially in the COVID times, startups face serious trouble because you can't retrenchment of employees is without the employee's consent, or the consent of the commissioner general is not possible. You can't cut down salary. Again, you can cut down only with the consent of the employee or the consent of the commissioner general. So during this COVID period, few startups suffered with not very much of fund backing, had to suffer. So this all there had been for a while now lobbying for employment law reforms, because these employment laws are quite archaic in that sense, because this doesn't suit the culture of this new IT sector, because turnover in IT sector is very high, at least to my understanding, and so this is another concern. And other thing is, I have come across companies which have employed workmen, employed people, but for several months they are unaware about payment of EPF and ETF. Now these are mandatory payments in Sri Lanka, and if a company fails to pay, contribute, and now these things on a monthly basis, then the directors are personally liable, and there is a penal penalty for them. Now these are serious concerns which several startups here, at least in my experience, have ignored and had to face certain bitter consequences. So that is the other aspect which startups have to be careful. So that these are the risks in startups treating legal matters as the least priority. Uh, of course, I came across a very odd issue a startup faced as well in recruitment of an employee. So they had a very tight budget. So these are not corporates; these are startup. They run in a very tight budget. A very tight budget of employees. So they can only hire a limited number of employees within their budget, but and those employees are very important because each head is very important in their field to fulfill their project targets. So they had hired an employee whom they were unaware at the time of hiring was at the pregnant and at the stage of delivering the baby. So after 1 month joining, that employee had applied for maternity leave. Now, under Sri Lankan law, the employees entitled for 84 days, as because they come under the Shop and Office Employees Act, they are entitled for 84 days. Now, 84 days is almost 3 months. Now, the startup had to pay for that employee for 3 months, and the difficulty is they are one head less. So they came up with this, and there is no other solution for them. So this is another. So this is not an issue for corporates, because corporates have bigger budgets and they always think about this, and they always adjust their budgets. They always have reservations. But startups don't think about these legal requirements, and this has posed a challenge. At least one anecdotal example I could give. So that is also one of the aspects the startup has to take into consideration in budgeting and these employment requirements. And coming back to EPF and ETF, startups think that getting an intern or an apprentice or someone as an intern, then they can avoid this. No, even for interns, if you're paying them, you still have to pay EPF and ETF. So again, a lot of startups who budget the salaries, they don't calculate this almost 15% additional contribution the startup has to make to the salaries. So these are all very important aspects which the startups are failing to consider. And on data protection, and as most of the startups are IT companies, as of now, as of to date, Sri Lanka does not have any specific laws on privacy and data protection. Said that, there is under the national digital policy, a draft data protection bill has been prepared, I do not believe that it has entered the legislation process. But if it is enacted, then it will protect personal data and processing and saving of personal data. In any event, what I have noticed, and I have advised most of these companies, because they have an intention to exit and they have foreign investors and foreign interest, have always upheld data protection to the GDPR standards, that is the European regulatory standards, and which they tend to do it because of at least on, if not for the legal requirement, because there's no legal requirement in Sri Lanka, but for on investor insistence. So that is one good thing I believe is happening with at least the companies I am working with. I can see them; they are working hard towards that. So that is also. But when this is enacted in Sri Lanka, they may have to think about it. Another aspect of some of the startups I'm doing with Jay, I always have regular conversations with him, and he assures me this product is not processing data, because everything is with the hospital. We don't have access to data, so we don't have to worry about it. So that's another side of how startups are tackling data protection issues. Of course, when I say legal aspects, there are several legal aspects that could come from, land owning and etc. etc. It can be a never-ending thing. I'll try to fit in some of the important things which I faced working with startups. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to take.
Thank you very much, Ashokbharan. I think there might be someone who asked a question. I think who wanted to know about coping with compliance issues, privacy, data protection, which I think you have covered. Do you want to add to the question? Unmute yourself if you're there.
I think I have a question from Yogesh. He's typed in the chat saying, can a US company operate a branch in Sri Lanka? Now, a branch is possible. Now, if you're a branch, you can be an overseas company which is having a branch office in Sri Lanka. So you can register yourself as a branch office and carry out your business. However, you cannot have trading or investment or sales in Sri Lanka. You can be a representative office, so you can't, and that overseas company here cannot enter into trade dealing. So everything has to be with the mother company. So yeah, you can have an overseas company, a representation office here.
Okay. Any other questions from, I think Guhan asked unmute.
Okay, thanks, Ramadan. Thank you everyone for the great presentations and sharing your achievements. It's very inspiring and extremely motivating. I just wanted to, from my perspective now, how you manage the underlying risk. That's my question now. Whether you do any proper. Actually, it was very nice to listen to the last presentation also, where some of these aspects were handled, but now, because the risk is always the main factor, that how we assess that, how we plan that, and how we mitigate that. There are so many different ways that we could do, even with the insurance. So how you are handling that is one of the things that I really want to hear from you. Of course, now it was mentioned about the data privacy protection and other things also, because especially now when we seek out or when we scale out for foreign territories, compliance is a very, very extremely important issue now, because I came across one of my practical experiences now, with my brief academic background also now. One of the university in UK now, when it started consulting, they started making huge amount of money, but they were building consultants. So, but when and actually it was a corporate, it was encouraged by the corporation as a whole. So they were hugely successful, but when there was one failure, and when it became a claimant issue, or when the claims were raised, they couldn't survive, and they couldn't sustain with the business model. So how you assess the risk and how you mitigate that is something that I would encourage all of you to think, and please share your experience also. Thank you.
So, sorry, Ashokbharan, do you have any comments on that, or?
I think the best advice I could give to any startup or any person interested in investing into startup is to have a legal budget, a budget for compliance, and not just legal, for compliance and legality, because when that is the least priority in your list. I mean, I can understand as a tech entrepreneur, you come from a tech background or a business background, and you're so passionate and you just want to go and establish it, but when you don't have that budget, then you get into this problem later onwards, where you want to expand, where you want to get investments. So I think that is one thing the people who want to get into startup has to think about, and investors should understand when they request for funds. Now that is other part of it. And consultancy, I mean, I think when one of the startups I went into, I was informed that they had gotten a valuation from a top 4 audit firm, because they had to get that services. I mean, although it is expensive, or compared to a startup, it's not a multinational corporation hiring them. It's a startup, but they had to do it because that was required by the investors. So these must, as a startup has to consider that these are inevitable expenses, and they have to do that. That's very important.
I have also another question. In an annual basis, in an audit report, does it also talk about risk, about the company exposure?
Well, as a private limited company, you're not required at least for the purpose of the registration and maintenance of the company, to fulfill all those requirements. You just have to file the annual returns with the Register of Companies. However, for taxation purposes, you need to require. I do not think even for taxation purposes these things are required. But I think a chartered accountant would be in a better position to advise on that.
So I think Jekhan now had a question to ask one of the earlier speakers. Jekhan, are you there? Jekhan Nalliah, is he?
I'm here.
Yeah, okay, please go ahead.
The question I wanted to ask a little while ago is that what Kumar is doing with Kale Systems and what is happening, Jay Krish is doing with Arogya Life. They're trying to change the culture of the people in Jaffna, like Kale, need to come here to change us. And that is one of the key reasons why I do whatever I can to encourage you, and why I will say to Miller, how long is it going to be before you open a branch in Jaffna? And that's what I have to say. So thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Jekhan, for those comments. I think they're all smiling and just glad to see that, that I think they feel appreciated coming back.